All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Website Security Tips webinar. My name is David Coatney, and I'm glad you're here today. While this webinar is geared toward managed service providers who are a little more tech savvy, it will also include some generic tips along the way that anybody can implement, like, not using the word admin for your username. So there should be a fair mix of things covered, and at the end, we'll cover some overall best practices as well. So we're a WordPress agency, and some of the suggestions made today will assume you either have access to cPanel or to File Manager via FTP, in addition to customization controls inside of your content management system. So if you're using a drag and drop builder like Squarespace or Wix, you probably won't have the level of access you need to implement some of these things. But again, hopefully some of the generic tips along the way will still be helpful. All right, let's look at some generic stats here. We've got 30,000 websites that are hacked every single day. I can't remember the percentage of overall websites that are eventually hacked, but it's quite large. Bots compose 42% of overall web traffic. Nearly two-thirds of those bots are malicious in intent, and everybody is a target. If you have a website, there are nefarious players who want to breach your website and will attempt to do so. How successful they are is completely up to you or the vendor you choose to manage it for you. And that's the point of today's webinar. So here's what to expect. Today, we're going to talk about SSL. We'll also go into some tips for user logins and passwords, some general rules to follow there. Then we'll talk about vulnerability scanning, keeping your software up to date, a web application firewall. We'll talk about XSS and SQL injections and what those are. Then we'll go into a content delivery network and how that can prevent DOS and DDoS attacks. And finally, we'll end with implementing a recovery plan and some overall best practices. So I'm David Coatney. By the way, just quick introductions here. With MSP Web Solutions, we offer web design, web hosting, online marketing, and search engine optimization. And that QR code will take you to my calendar if you're interested in scheduling a consultation to talk about your website, your security, or just your marketing needs. So if you want to book an appointment, you can do so by scanning the QR code, and we'll be happy to help. All right, so let's jump right in with SSL. So most people on this call likely know what an SSL certificate is, so I'm not going to go too in depth into that, aside from saying that it's critical that it's installed correctly when you launch your website. And one of the reasons is security is a ranking factor for Google. So it's actually a fairly significant ranking factor. And while there are 1,000 things that go into Google's algorithm, if you have two websites and everything else is comparable, and one of them's secure and one of them's not, Google is going to give precedent to the secure website. It's also important to make sure that you have properly configured HTTPS and that everything is resolving to the same place. So whatever your canonical URL is, that's going to be in your .htaccess file, the URL that you're submitting to Google. You want to make sure that everything resolves there. So whether it's the www or the non-www, the important thing is it all goes there. Same thing with HTTPS. So easiest way to figure out if that's happening, if that redirect is occurring, is if you go up to your address bar and you double click on it, so it pulls up the full address and it says HTTPS secure. Okay, great. Now delete the S and then reload it with just HTTP and see, does it automatically redirect to HTTPS, or does it load a separate copy of your website that's HTTP? If it loads a separate version of your website, then you need to set a forced redirect. And that's something that can be done in your .htaccess file. It's a couple lines of code. You should be able to Google it pretty simply and just make sure to, switch the domain out, obviously, in the code. But, keep in mind, if you're doing that, it's very easy to break your website editing the .htaccess file if you don't know what you're doing. Even inserting the correct code into the wrong place in that file will crash your website. So, as a general rule of thumb, if you're going to try to edit the .htaccess file, um, it's best to back the whole thing up. Just copy all that code, paste it into Notepad, not Word, but Notepad. That's really good about preserving code. That way, if you save the file, you refresh the site, it breaks the site, you can paste it right back, resave it, boom, and then you've got your website back up 5 seconds after you've crashed it. So that's the protocol you want to follow whenever editing that .htaccess file. It's a hidden file too, so if you log into your public HTML folder and you don't see it there, you may have to go to settings and there's a little switch you can toggle that says show hidden files. All right, now let's get into some good rules for user logins. The first is never use admin as a username. Uh, 48% of attempted login attempts from hackers and bots use admin as the username and then just try to guess passwords. And that's because they think you're predictable. And I got to be honest with you, I actually think that statistic seems really low because I see every time somebody tries to log into one of our websites, and I would estimate that's probably 75, 80% of them are attempting to log in as admin. So just by simply not setting your username as admin, you can automatically prevent half of all login attempts from succeeding. That's huge, guys. If you have a website and your username is admin, you should change it now. If you don't remember anything else from this webinar, let that be your biggest takeaway. You can also create a rule where anyone who attempts to log in with admin is automatically blocked, which if you don't have admin as one of your usernames, there's no reason not to set that rule. Now, that's not to say that they may not be using a VPN to route through different IPs. So even if you block this IP, they may come in through, through another one, but we'll address that as well. And you always want to enforce strong passwords. That goes without saying. And I didn't say use strong fat passwords. I said enforce. So as the security admin, you want to set hard rules that require all users to have strong passwords. So if one of your users decides to reset their password as, password 123, it's going to reject that. Ideally, you want at least 12 characters. That includes uppercase and lowercase letters, numbers and symbols, and then don't use actual words. And most platforms these days have password generators that will do a pretty good job of that as well. You can also enforce password periods in your security tool. A lot of plugins will allow you to do this. I use Solid Security Pro, but there are a lot of other plugins that will do the same thing as well. And you can set the parameters on how long you want those passwords to be reset. And so what will happen, let's say you set it for 6 months. When somebody logs in after 6 months of changing their password, it's going to take them to a screen to prompt them to change that password again. In addition to strong passwords, using multi-factor authentication is a great way to thwart login attempts as well. Just remember, if it annoys you, it annoys hackers trying to hack into your website even more. And there's another form of multi-factor authentication too called magic links that you can implement where it's basically a passwordless entry. So it basically sends that directly to your email. You follow the link and it takes you straight into the website. I don't really use that. I use traditional multi-factor authentication, but just be aware that that's an option as well. The fewer access points, the better. So, do a dozen people really need access to your website? And whenever we get a new website to host, that's the first thing I ask when I go and I see the users. I say, okay, who really needs to be here? So if you have somebody on the back end of WordPress that's set up as a user, they haven't logged on in a year, but you still got them on there just on the off chance that for some reason down the road, look, they don't need a user ID. You can delete that, and if at some point it comes up and they need access again, you can create new credentials for them or temporary credentials for whatever they need to do. The fewer people who have administrative access, the easier it is to keep track of everyone and the less points of entry there are. So when somebody leaves your company, especially if they're terminated, you want to double check their user permission and disable that account immediately. All right, set up notifications. So I have notifications set up if somebody tries to log in. I get a notice. I know that annoys some people, but um, you know, if it gets too annoying, what I'll do is I'll just reset the login screen, and that's something you can do as well, is you can hide the default login screen. So every hacker, every bot knows the WordPress defaults to get to that login screen, that / WP hyphen login.php. And so you can actually change that. So where if they go to that address, it's going to give them a 404 error. So use your own custom login screen. If they're still coming in and trying to log in and accessing that login screen, you can disable the XML file because a lot of smart bots and smart hackers know that you can still access that through XML. So what you'll want to do is disable XML RPC. And there are a couple ways you could do that. One is through editing the .htaccess file. It's a simple line of PHP code that will do that for you. The other is through a plugin. And so a lot of plugins will do that. If you have, like let's say WP code, also called code snippets, it's a very common plugin. You can click add snippet and it's got a preset in there. You can do a little search XML, it'll come up and just click on that one, activate it, save it, and it'll take that little line of PHP code and put it in your header that will disable that XML file, and then people won't be able to access your login screen anymore unless they have the unique slug that you've created for that screen. All right, that leads us to vulnerability scanning. There are server-side tools that will do this for you, and there are also CMS tools and plugins that will do this as well. But you want to make sure you keep all software and patches up to date. Identify any vulnerable software and regularly check for updates and ensure that it's licensed. If it's not licensed, then you won't be receiving those updates in many cases. And so that's why purchasing all the license for the plugins, the theme that you're using are very important. Most website attacks originate through the content management system, and oftentimes they're entering through outdated software. And I don't remember the percentage offhand of website security breaches and malware incidents that occur through vulnerable software and outdated plugins as opposed to, logging in. But it's substantial. Question I often receive. So we log into the back end of our clients' websites. We're there every week running plugin updates, theme updates, WordPress updates. If, the PHP version needs to be updated, we're on top of that. And I frequently get asked, can't you automate that? And the answer is yes, I can, and no, I won't. I like to be on the website when plugins are being updated so I can test it. It's not common, but it does happen where a plugin may update and now suddenly it's incompatible with something else. And so there's a conflict and you may have to test that. So if being on the back end of websites every week to run updates isn't something you think you'll do, then hire somebody who will. And I'll give you an example. We had a client recently. Their website had Lightspeed Cache, which just comes standard on a lot of different themes. And so it's basically a caching plugin, but we've disabled all the auto updates. But this one likes to re-enable itself and then auto update anyway. And so it sort of resets itself. So anyway, I get a notification, the site goes down. I check the logs to see recent changes, and I see that this plugin just recently updated itself. And I'm not able to get into the back end of the website, but because I know what it was, because I had that log there, I was still able to go into cPanel, go straight to that folder, delete the folder for that caching plugin, and then refresh the site, came back live, logged in, and then installed a different caching plugin. I think I used WP Rocket for that, probably. But that also brings up another important point. Not just how sometimes if a plugin updates, there can cause a conflict, and that's why it's good to be on the site to test that. And same thing when you're updating a theme. But there's also a process there, and this is why I recommend that you keep a monitor of file changes on your website, so that if something goes down, and this is not just for security, this could just be for updates as well, that you can instantly look at that log, find the source, and go straight to it to diagnose the problem. All right, now to some fun stuff here, the web application firewall. So we're going to talk about XSS and SQL, which are both code injections. SQL will exploit web apps and enter an SQL command in the input form, whereas XSS targets JavaScript. But the primary goal of SQL injections are to steal information from your database or delete it or modify it. So they can steal credit card information, personal info, confidential client data. And once hackers have access to your database, they can destroy the sensitive information or they can copy it and then sell it on the dark web. Whereas XSS attacks will often redirect users to a fake website to extract information from them, and they can download malware and impersonate their target. So SQL is basically trying to access your database. They're going after your information, whereas XSS is targeting your users. And essentially, a web application firewall acts as a shield between your web applications and the rest of the internet. So it monitors all the traffic that's trying to pass through the web app, and it's blocking any attempt to exploit vulnerabilities. Some other good rules here is to ban repeat lockout offenders. So you can ban that IP. If you have an employee that's supposed to have access and they just forgot their password, that you could always end up banning them as well. But it's very easy to just go back and whitelist their IP if that happens. So I want to worry about that. There is a default ban list created by Jim Walker. It's a list of known offenders and nefarious IP addresses. So you can import those and automatically ban all of those IPs, which I highly recommend doing. It's a really good starting place. All right. Finally, implementing a recovery plan. Pre-research software. What I mean by here, I'm not talking about the software that you're going to be using. I'm talking about the software that you hope to never be using. So if you're doing all of the things that we're addressing in this webinar, you shouldn't have an issue with malware. But it's good to have your research done in advance and have that there just in case. So, if an incident happens, you don't want to then start doing research and comparing plans and like, what's the best thing for this? You want to have that kind of off sitting there to the side. And so you already have a plan in place if the worst case scenario were to happen. I also recommend a monitor. I put Uptime Robot on there. I could have just as easily put monitor. There are a bunch of different monitors out there. Uptime Robot is just the one that we use, but the basic goal here is that it scans your site, and if ever goes down, there's an issue with the servers, it's going to send you a real-time notification to let you know that your site just went down. And then it'll also send you one when it goes back up. So you get that notification, you can drop what you're doing, turn your attention to the problem right away. Again, if you're monitoring file changes, you can check to see what's happened there and then go back and troubleshoot and fix it. And backup. This goes without saying, guys. And this should go without saying, but you do have to say this to people. Keep online and offline backups. I'm really surprised at the sheer number of developers who say, oh, we've got our backups in cPanel. Like, okay, and what happens when something happens with cPanel, right? What happens when you get locked out? Or, even worse, some that just keep it on the back end of the WordPress installation. I'm like, don't do that. You got to do better than that. So it's important to keep backup files in a secure location separate from your website files and download that offline. Because keep in mind, if a hacker gets into your web account, they also have access to your backups. Saving your files offline gives you an alternative to paying a ransom because you don't need them to restore the encrypted files. You can restore it yourself instead of paying the criminal. So that's why you should always keep it both online and offline. All right, best practices. Limit access to your security. So just because someone needs admin access to your WordPress site doesn't mean they need access to be able to change your security settings in the back end of WordPress. And so you should be able to set who can and cannot see that. Also limit access to your website itself and restrict admin privileges to only those who need it. Implement a web scanner. And there are two types of scanners. There's the vulnerability scanning for software, which we talked about earlier, but there should be another site scanner that can also identify other security areas to improve. Then you can change your default settings as well. Once again, every hacker knows the default settings. Every bot is programmed to know the default settings. Use a content delivery network, which I thought I had a slide for that. Let me go back. Did I skip that slide? Not sure what happened to that. No, it doesn't look like I have. Okay. Well, I should have had a slide in here for content delivery networks. That's okay. I'll just talk about it now for a moment. So typically a content delivery network is used to improve website performance, and it's not always necessary. But the right CDN can also secure a website by offering DDoS protection. So you've got DOS and DDoS. DOS is denial of service, is what that stands for. And it uses a single source of attack, whereas DDoS uses multiple dispersed attacks coming from different locations, which can make it harder to fight. The goal of a DDoS attack is to overwhelm your servers with traffic to crash the website. So, unlike many other attacks we mentioned, this one is not a breach. It's not a security breach because they haven't gained access to anything, but it is still malicious. And putting your site behind a CDN like Cloudflare can stop that attacker because it redistributes the sudden increase in traffic that comes from a DDoS attack. And that way, your origin web server, it stays up and it doesn't get overwhelmed. All right, limit personal and sensitive information collected and stored. Um, Something to be mindful of. Does everything need to be stored there permanently? Regularly monitor logs, conduct security audits, monitor file changes. We kind of talked about that earlier and the reason for doing that. And most importantly, have a recovery plan in place. All right, so I covered a lot of topics today. Wow, it's only taken 22 minutes, so we went by a lot faster than I thought. But hope you learned a lot about website security. Now you're at a point where you could go the DIY route. You could do it alone, put this stuff into action, stay vigilant, or you could work with an expert by partnering with a WordPress agency like ours who specializes in this and have us do that for you. So let me explain to you what it looks like to work with an expert. Our standard monthly hosting package includes website maintenance and security, where we implement the things that we talked about today. We stay on top of all the updates and we keep your site protected. If that's something you're interested in, we're going to offer the first month of hosting for free for the first 5 people who sign up on a hosting plan after watching this webinar. And once again, the QR code here is a link to my calendar. So if you want to talk about anything else like web design or SEO, you could schedule a consultation via that link. Otherwise, feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to help. So my email's there on the screen, and that's all I have today. So thank you guys so much for watching, and take care. All right, bye.